So the last thing I want to go over is the end of the Cold War. Now, your book makes a lot out of U.S. intervention in the world, while the USSR seems to sort of loom in the background. But the Soviet Union was just as involved in other countries' affairs as the United States. Now, the primary focus was obviously on Russia and then the other members in the Soviet Union, controlling the populations, the resources, party policies, and then, of course, their next focus would be anything on the border. In Eastern Europe, smashing the Hungarian revolt of 1954, making sure that all these satellite nations in Eastern Europe remain loyal, that the communist parties, communist governments of each respective nation remained in power, because it's impossible to break that union. If there is a break anywhere in the Soviet bloc, that implies that communism and the Soviet Union itself is a failure. Then, of course, there's their focus on Asia. Despite the strained relationship with China, they are going to continue to give aid. There is support for Vietnam, for Cambodia, for Korea, their communist regimes. There is assistance for India. Remember that Nehru does have some interest in Marxism and communism. And that also helps balance out the U.S. intervention in Pakistan, which was the vivisection, the division of India, the Muslim population that wanted to formally divide from the Hindu population. And of course, similar issues in newly independent African nations. And then what we have, or the the primary objective that or the primary focus I'm looking at for the Soviet Union is going to be Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan, or the war in Afghanistan that goes from 1979 through 1989, 88, is quite often referred to as the Soviet Union's Vietnam. What's going on in Afghanistan is that Afghanistan borders a number of other Arab nations that are actually included inside the Soviet bloc. And so the Soviet Union wants to have good relationships with those nations on their borders. So they want to have sympathetic governments, even though they might not necessarily be incorporated into the bloc. And Afghanistan is one of those. Afghanistan is also going to be an outlet to possible oil reserves for the Soviet Union, very much necessary for industry. So within the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, it's definitely a pro-Soviet government which the Soviet Union helped install. But it was done so at the objections of a number of Arab nationalists and other individual groups, most notably the Mujahideen, jihadist forces which are focused on eliminating the official government of Afghanistan and to bring back their own personal policies to Afghanistan. So this is, again, the Taliban fighting against the Soviet Union and the Democratic Republic. Now, the 9 years that Russia spends in Afghanistan is an absolute disaster for the country. Alcoholism, suicide, depression was rife amongst Soviet soldiers who were there. And this involvement in Afghanistan, when the Soviet Union finally decided, okay, we have to withdraw just to save ourselves, we can't keep fighting this any longer. And then, of course, the Taliban took over Afghanistan. The Soviet involvement in Afghanistan was one of the many signs to Mikhail Gorbachev, who attained premiership of the Soviet Union, that the system could not be sustained as is. The failures that we looked at in China in terms of the Great Leap Forward are epidemic amongst nearly all of the Soviet members. Production is not at all in competition with the United States. Generally, whatever industrial tools or products they produce are of poor quality. Goods like tractors or industrial machines are inefficient, out of date, and almost no one wants to buy them, whereas they do want to buy the sleek little models that are coming out of the United States, out of Great Britain, out of Germany, out of Japan. Food imports are incredibly common, but are generally disguised in the public media, so the public doesn't really, so the party doesn't have to admit that, okay, no, we couldn't feed our own nation, we're actually having to buy grain from abroad. And consumer goods are almost non existent. Their black markets are rife in Western goods that are illegal in the Soviet bloc. Trading, bartering systems are a way of finding needed goods. If you see a store and there's a massive line, you get in that line. It doesn't matter what they're selling, you're going to buy whatever they have because then you can trade for something else. You buy a pair of size 11 boots. You have a perfectly good pair of boots, but your neighbor upstairs might need those boots and he can trade you some toilet paper. So, I mean, not just consumer goods in the way of radios or televisions or pleasurable goods, but necessities like toiletries, like shoes, like clothes. Those sorts of things were very, very difficult to get a hold of in the Soviet bloc. And of course, the government's very bloated bureaucracy and inefficiency, that's not helping matters in any manner. So what Gorbachev is introducing is glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. The idea of the openness, now there is still very guarded language in terms of what is allowed, very much still suspect of too much open criticism. But Gorbachev argues that there has to be an official public stance, some sort of working with the public, that the system does need work itself. So what reforms need to occur? There's definitely cautiously refraining from direct intervention in other Soviet states. So labor unions, new political parties, they're going to be forming in nations like Poland, in Czechoslovakia. And those other communist governments, because they don't always have the backing support of the Soviet Union, of Russia, they're sort of allowed to take place. Now, this is going to be incredibly difficult. Part of the reason why your book says the Cold War ended peaceably is not because the communist leaders just sat back and twiddled their thumbs while everyone else came in. They're saying it ended peacefully because it didn't go into a hot war. There wasn't this massive stand down between the Soviet Union backing up anti-Soviets and the USSR. But the way to come out from under communism in the Eastern Bloc was incredibly fraught with danger. And there was a major struggle for other nationalities to break out of the grip of party control. And then, of course, there is the restructuring.